Good morning, everyone. Good morning. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm Michael Fotheringham, Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Actually, if you were here yesterday, I'm still that. Welcome to day 2 of the 13th National Housing Conference. Yesterday's sessions were a fantastic start, I think, to the conference. Lots of great conversations, great opportunity to network with people and some really good ideas being shared across all parts of the housing system. We've got another action-packed day today, but before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, here in Meanjin or Brisbane, and remotely across the nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I'd also like to thank Link Wentworth for their support of this plenary session and their ongoing support of the National Housing Conference over a number of years, and I believe we have a short video from them.
Looking to the future, we're really keen at Link Wentworth to work with government and the private sector to help deliver more homes, to help improve the planning system, streamline processes, develop long-term policy, and actually set the groundworks to deliver a pipeline of good quality social and affordable housing in the years to come.
So thank you, Link Wentworth, for your ongoing support. Those of you who've been to the National Housing Conference in the past will perhaps recall our States of the Nation sessions. They're always a highlight, and for many years we brought together the heads of each of the state departments for public housing departments from around the country to talk about the different programs in each state. Over the COVID period, that's been a little more challenging, so we've branched out and looked at different parts of the housing system, and we're repeating that method today with speakers from different parts of the housing sector across real estate, property development, community housing, public housing, and housing policy more broadly. So, joining me on stage, Emma Slape, the CEO of Turner Real Estate and the Director of the Real Estate Institute of South Australia. Tanya Steinbeck, or I'm out of order. Tanya Steinbeck is the Chief Executive of Urban Development Institute of Australia, WA, and a former Director of the WA Housing Authority. In the middle, Trudi Ray is the CEO of Haven Homes Safe and Chair of the Community Housing Industry Association Victoria. And Mark Cridland, at the far end from me, is the Director General of the newly configured Queensland Department of Housing and Chair of the Housing Delivery Board, which we'll hear about shortly. Look, like many other developed nations, Australia today faces many challenges to our housing system: cost of living, undersupply met with rapidly increasing demand, workforce and supply chain constraints, just to name a few. So this session is looking about a way forward from multiple perspectives. We're really going to ask the question, what are the steps we all need to take to achieve a better housing outcome into the future? I'll start by asking each of the panellists to offer 3 or 4 minutes worth of observations before we move into broader conversation. Emma.
Thank you, Michael. I work for a large real estate agency and have done so for the past 10 years and also been involved in housing for the last 2 decades. So a few observations that we've seen really take more prominence in the last few years have been a change in demand in different house types. I think, traditionally Australia has built 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom homes, and that's been what everybody feels is what the nation needs. But I think COVID has accelerated and really shown us that people are looking for different things in housing. And that's probably at 2 ends of the spectrum. We're seeing people demand and look for smaller homes, perhaps with a lot more community space and community facilities so they can work from home, perhaps being single. We've seen a higher separation rate as well in divorce, so we're particularly seeing people, particularly women over 50, seeking a smaller house and more of a community. And at the other end, but still with the same theme, we've seen people looking to live together, either as larger families again, or perhaps with friends as well in larger 4 or 5-bedroom homes, and going back to wanting that granny flat or something else there as well. And of course, in the middle, there's everything in between. But I think that those sort of 2 ends are things that, as we look to the future and what people are looking for, we've got to be really cognizant of and ensure that the infrastructure around those types of things exists, but we're also offering greater housing choice. A few observations in relation to what we've seen really change. We're at the end of NRAS. Our agency did manage NRAS, and I think there was some really great parts of NRAS, but observations on the poor parts is that the investors that were attracted to it for the tax incentives. And we're seeing every time when it's coming to 3 months, considering what they're going to do, a lot of them are favouring selling, which is really disappointing. So I think there's great lessons that we can learn from that. But unfortunately, when they're sold, they are a great way for first home buyers to get into the market. So it's a win for first home buyers and securing their own property, but it's a loss to the rental market. And of course, in recent times, we've sort of found those factors really putting pressure on the rental market overall. And of course, with continued migration estimates, we are concerned about the number of houses on the market for both sort of owner-occupiers and rentals, but what that pipeline looks like and how we can achieve that in a good and stable way, as we have seen a lot of investors exit the market due to strong capital gains, and that has shrunk the pool. So it's been a really interesting couple of years in real estate, and I think we've got some challenges as a community. The final thing that I would like to kind of just say in some opening remarks is I think we've seen a real sort of blur between what would have traditionally been public housing and where that sits and who would live in that, social housing and the private rental market. And I suppose we're finding the private rental market is having to wear more of that, which is okay if the stock is there. And of course, that's the problem. So sort of finding ways to bridge those 3 different sectors, I think is really valuable and why I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in the debate today, Michael.
Thanks, Emma. Trudi.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thank you all very much for your interest. And I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners of the lands in which we meet, and all those on remote. And also want to shout out to my Victorian colleagues. As you know, I will be really focusing on regional Victoria, but it's not misplaced on me that we all are here together, and I really just like to shout out to the Vic people. So Haven Home Safe, so we're a community housing organisation that also has a homeless portfolio. We have approximately 2,000 homes. We have 3 of the homeless access points in regional Victoria and 1 in metropolitan Melbourne. We've been operating for 40 years in this space, and certainly I've been there almost 20 years and see how that has changed, evolved and certainly grown in terms of the crisis numbers, particularly in the last 10 or so years. The current housing shortage in Victoria is still the lowest within the nation, and people will be quite surprised to hear that, because with record investment from the Victorian government of $5.3 billion in housing, we've still got a ways to go. But the great thing about that investment is that the properties are starting to come fruition. It's taken quite some time to get it out of the ground and get the planning approvals through, and certainly we're finding some challenges, particularly in regional spaces with supply, with having planning processes being able to go through, not because councils are slack, because they just don't have the staff or the skills within their teams to be able to put them through. But we are also seeing really growing complexities, particularly in the regional space with migration through the pandemic. We had significant numbers of people coming out of Melbourne, which you could absolutely understand given all the lockdowns, but coming into regional Victoria and taking up quite a lot of that supply. So we are certainly really kind of concerned about what that means for regional areas and how people are navigating the issues that we certainly have. Just last week, in the state, there was evacuations due to bushfires, and then the following, couple of days later, they were evacuated because of floods. Like, we are seeing such an increase complexity of climate change. We are seeing this on the front page of the paper last year. A year ago, we had the Rochester floods, which is only 40 minutes away from Bendigo. 90% of the town is uninhabitable. Once the ABC and the Channel 7s, etc., leave, then also the communities surrounding that kind of forget that happens. But we have a significant number of houses that need to be rebuilt from that Rochester floods, but also from the bushfires in 2019. So there's a crisis that is continually happening that we as a housing sector need to really pick up on. But there's some really critical factors that need to be worked out ahead of the housing blitz that will come because of the new Victorian Housing Statement. And it's really happy to focus on the statement. There's some really great, exciting elements within that. There's some questions within that we need to navigate and work together. But I think the great thing about the Victorian Housing Statement is that finally we have something that has a discipline to it, that has us all walking together in the same pathway, trying to get the greatest outcomes for Victorians. So that's really, really positive. Probably stop there. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Trudi. And then over from Western Australia.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. It's fantastic to be over in Brisbane and out of Western Australia. I was just commenting before, our borders are finally open and our previous Premier's disappeared. So I have confidence I can travel freely. I guess some observations from Western Australia. Obviously, as a state, we are significantly resources sector driven. And that is continuing to cause some significant challenges in terms of our construction workforce. But I guess talking about housing supply in particular, I guess my reflection is that this is not a new issue. You know, we've had chronic undersupply in this country since at least 2005, and so it's, I think, an amazing opportunity, as we discussed yesterday, that we have all three levels of government, state, federal, local, all singing from the same hymn sheet now in terms of the need for supply or additional supply. One of the challenges that we faced in Western Australia was the lack of counter-cyclical investment in social and affordable housing. And so for some years prior to COVID hitting, we had very little activity in the construction sector, housing construction sector, and as a result, our workforce disappeared and went to the mining sector, went to work on government infrastructure projects. And so when the COVID hit and the stimulus, demand-side stimulus was announced, both state-based building bonus and a federal home builder bonus, first home buyers were really blessed, I guess, with one of the largest incentives that we'd ever seen at a state level of up to $75,000 towards, you know, the purchase of a home. And as a result, that absolutely blew the doors off our industry in terms of demand, and we did not have the workforce capacity to be able to respond. So now, 2 years later down the track, we are just coming to the end of delivering the houses that were committed under those schemes. And suffering, just as many others are across the country, from severe skills shortages. I guess the other challenge that we have in Perth is the lack of development-ready land. So whilst I think the perception is that there's plenty there, that may be the case, but when you take into account the numerous constraints that exist to be able to bring that land to market in a speedy way, because I think speed to market is critical, there's actually nowhere near as much development-ready land as what I think certainly the government seems to think there is. So they're kind of the key challenges, I guess. I think there's a lot of other opportunities in talking about the need for more middle ring, medium density development. Certainly that's the case in Perth. The challenge at the moment is, as we discussed yesterday, construction costs are making sort of high density projects and apartment projects unfeasible to deliver unless they're in the western suburbs and have the underlying land value to make them work. So medium density and house and land projects are the ones that are able to respond quicker to the demand that we're going to experience in the future. So I think that's a great opportunity. And I'd probably just finish with saying that I think the Housing Accord and the HAF are a fantastic opportunity for the private sector, the public sector, community housing sector to work collaboratively. I see it as complementary, not competitive. So I guess, you know, entering this discussion, it's in a collaborative way. I think that we can all work together, and I think we will need to, given the ambitious targets that we have set for us.
Terrific. Thank you, Tanya. Mark.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I also, I'm going to look this way because I think everyone's been looking this way. I'm going to make sure this part of the room's included. Can I also acknowledge my colleagues from the Department of Housing here today and our partners from the housing and homelessness sector, and thank you for all the great work that you do. Michael, you mentioned that we now have a standalone Department of Housing in Queensland. That's right, set up on the 18th of May, and from the conversations already had with my colleagues from other jurisdictions, it's of great interest. And can I say my observations since it's commenced, it is fantastic. We have a dedicated Minister for Housing, a dedicated Director General, and if you're here at 1:15 today, you'll hear from the Queensland Housing Minister, who is bringing great energy and great passion as a former resident of social housing growing up to this portfolio. So I'd encourage you to really attend that session if you can. So having all of that's great, but it needs to be backed in, and the government is doing that. They've set up our own committee of cabinet, so we have a housing cabinet committee that we can access and engages with us on a regular basis. It's chaired by the Premier herself. It has the Deputy Premier and the Treasurer as ministers, which is a great forum, great clearinghouse for us to go to get progress that we need quickly, while not competing in the fuller cabinet agenda with a lot of other items. They've backed it in with an additional $1.1 billion in funding this year, which is incredibly important. So now the organisation sits at about 1,300 people, $2.5 billion budget and about $19 billion in assets. So it is a fair dinkum department, I feel like, but really focused. So that investment is probably the largest concentrated investment in Queensland's history as we understand it. It's going to support the delivery of an additional 13,500 social and affordable homes, and provides over 200,000 forms of housing assistance, be that rent assistance or emergency accommodation, each and every year. They consolidated functions from other departments that we needed to actually address the entire spectrum of housing challenge. So the $2 billion housing investment fund that was in Queensland Treasury was brought into our department, and that'll deliver 5,600 social and affordable homes, and we've been out in market for that already. It also, as you mentioned, Michael, brought to us the Housing Delivery Board, the Housing Expert Supply Panel and the Housing Opportunities Portal from our planning department, and they are really good initiatives which we might explore a bit later. But the Housing Delivery Board comprises 7 Directors General and the General Manager of Economic Development Queensland, and they all show up and they all participate, and it's focused on delivering 51 housing outcomes that came from the Premier's Housing Summit almost a year ago, where 200 industry stakeholders attended and gave us ideas of how to address that challenge. So that's well underway, and I'm sure there'll be an update in coming weeks. So all of that was about bringing, in the Premier's own words, focus and energy to the challenges we have with housing in Queensland. Many of those are being experienced across the nation, so I won't go into all of those because I'm sure there's been plenty of people admiring that problem over the last day, and will continue to, but I do just want to give some Queensland specific context given this is states of the nation. So we experienced during COVID and just after COVID the highest net interstate migration in the country. That had an impact. What we saw was that as a result of that is the sale of existing homes that usually bumped along around somewhere around an average of 8,000 homes a year increased by between 100 and 225% from mid-2020 till December 2022. And the 225% was in regional Queensland. The 100% was in the southeast corner, but regional Queensland really felt that. That saw a drop in available rental properties, that saw price competitiveness increase. And now what we are experiencing is net overseas migration, which is absolutely eclipsing the rate of interstate migration that we experienced. So just last quarter, Treasury tells us that we experienced population growth at all-time highs here in Queensland. Now that is difficult to address. But there are some positive signs in our latest analysis, just in a Queensland context. We are seeing vacancy rates rising. We are seeing the growth in new rents, which we're really experiencing the high rental increases, slow. We're seeing construction inflation slowing, and we're seeing investor demand recovering. So in the future, what does the future hold? Well, the Premier and the Minister have asked us to prepare a 20-year Queensland housing plan to address these challenges in the medium to long run. Thanks to AHURI is actually helping us with some of that work in terms of developing a predictive demand model for social and affordable housing in Queensland. So as we finalise that plan, we've got a lot of people here from the department who are very keen to hear all of the fantastic ideas, and I look forward to answering your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I'll come back to you in just a minute. I'll just add that if anyone wants to ask questions of any of the members of the panel, please feel free to use the portal to do so, and we'll have roving microphones in a moment. But before I go to the floor, Mark, I'm just going to stay with you for a little longer. You know, we've talked about we've heard from you some of the government structures and things that are coming into play there, but there's another dimension there in listening to the sector, listening to experts around the state. And so a little over a year ago, there was a Premier's Roundtable where we had the Premier, the Deputy Premier, ministers for infrastructure, building, housing, and a range of other portfolios, with key sector leaders from a range of industry perspectives, communities perspectives, and research, which is important. Yeah. That then led to a summit in this very building, the other end of this building, with a couple of hundred people involved from a very wide range of sectors. A couple more Premiers' Roundtables since then, and I believe that series will continue. How are those shaping the government's approach to the housing challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, the summit was held almost a year ago. In fact, I think it'll be a year next week. 200 people attended. Out of that came some great ideas. In fact, 51 that the Housing Delivery Board with the 7 Directors General, which includes Premier and Cabinet, Treasury, State Development, Planning, Housing, so you know they're all there. They have courage of making sure that we work across government to deliver all of those 51 initiatives that came out of that summit. And as you mentioned, the Premier's hosted 2 roundtables since to report on progress, and you'll see those reports online if you want to go and have a look. But I think what the Housing Delivery Board and the Housing Expert Supply Panel, Michael, which I know you're a member of, which is 12 external people, what they do is recognise that this is not a challenge that government on its own can solve, or that any one department of government can solve, or any one level of government can solve. It has to be a consolidated response. And I'm new to the portfolio, but I have to say it was really encouraging to see the government to come into an environment where the government's actively encouraging everyone to contribute to how we solve this. So for me, it meant we had a great network built up. We have experts on tap. Not only did the experts in the Housing Expert Supply Panel have their own work program, but if we want to say, like we have, look, how do we grow the community housing sector? How do we get more supply for this type of product in density? Then that's commissioned, and they come back to us with their expert advice. It's a different model for government, but in my experience so far, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. We might bring the house lights up just a shade so that we can see hands raised. Does anyone have questions they'd like to ask at this stage? We have one over here, if we can get a microphone over there. Just keep your hand up so that the mic runners can see you. I'm trying to see where the mic runner is at the moment. Just over here, please. While the microphone comes across one bay and heads down about 4 or 5 rows, Tanya, one of the things you mentioned was losing workforce to mining in particular in the WA context. I think that's probably pretty relevant in the Queensland context as well, where mining is also a significant factor. What sorts of approaches do you think are going to work or have been tried to work to bring that workforce back into housing construction?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think there's an enormous amount of effort going into trying to communicate the value of a trade. So I think there's obviously a conversation going on federally around, the workforce and what we need to do to build capacity in the sector nationally. In Western Australia, we have a construction training fund, which do an amazing job in I guess, engaging with particularly school students, high school students, and encouraging our young people to consider a trade as an alternative to university. I think, we always tend to default towards encouraging children to go and get a degree historically and choose a university path, but a trade is an equally as valuable occupation. So there's a lot of effort being invested in terms of incentivising TAFE placements and vet training to try and get a greater degree of apprenticeships in the system. So I guess there's the existing capacity within the population of Perth and Western Australia that we're trying to encourage the young ones into the sector. But then secondly, looking at that takes time. And so we're looking at incentivising, from a migration perspective, providing housing incentives, contribution towards rents and other things to encourage migrants to choose to come to Perth instead of Brisbane.
Good luck. Yeah.
Which in itself is an issue, right? Because, we all need greater capacity. And so, it's kind of, we were talking before about robbing Peter to pay Paul. Each state's got a, jostling for the same finite workforce capacity at the moment. And so that migration element is absolutely critical, and in WA we've got the highest level of migration that we've seen, which is causing the chicken and the egg issue that we have, where we don't have enough housing to house the workers to build the housing, and it's a really complex issue, but there's certainly a lot of time and effort and resources being thrown at trying to build the workforce capacity, but it's very difficult when you've got a mining sector that can pay significantly higher salaries, and we are very much a FIFO sort of based city.
I want to pick up on that population movement angle in a moment. We've seen people move out of Melbourne into regional Victoria quite a lot during the COVID period. We heard the Ring of Steel, all of that. I think people understand what happened there. We're seeing, since the pandemic, a lot of movement into southeast Queensland from the south. So those are playing particular pressures on particular geographic markets. So I want to come to that in a moment. But first, there was a question up here. We have the microphone up there.
Thanks, Michael. Darren Mew from Blue CHP. Probably a question for Mark, really. But reflecting on those previous comments, there's a bit of a race, obviously, a race to attract workers. There's going to be a race to attract the HAF funding. And pleasing to hear this morning from Nathan Dalbon of NIFIC, soon to be Housing Australia, that the HAF will likely open this year, meaning we'll go into a bit of a sprint, I think, as a collective industry and sector to put submissions to the federal government. And so, Mark, you've noted that the Department of Housing, having been stood up here in Queensland, has attracted quite a bit of interest interstate. A question to you would be just to ask what level of preparedness, collaboration, coordination you think is needed to help accelerate that funding to Queensland, noting we've probably underperformed in previous bond rounds, but it will require coordination. I'm just an invitation to you to talk to us about what the government can do and how we can support you.
Excellent. Thanks, Darren. I can't actually see where you are, so I may be looking in the completely wrong direction.
Just here.
Oh, there you are. Hello, good to see you. Yeah, look, great question. Yeah, of course, Queensland being pro as we are, we want our fair share or more of the HAF. And yes, just yesterday we had a Queensland workshop with NIFIC, with Nathan and his team, and I don't want to get Nathan into any strife with other jurisdictions, but he did say to me that was the first workshop with Queensland here, so we're out of the blocks on that. We will definitely, so can't help it, it's Queensland here. And look, what I have to say on Queensland, if you've all walked outside while you've been visiting here, that you understand why people want to come here. It's beautiful, lovely. I'd encourage you to walk down to South Bank and buy an ice cream at Streets Beach. But back to your question, Darren, sorry. We definitely think we need a bid strategy for Queensland. So when it does open, that we are ready with our partners to to be out of the blocks early. I hope it's like our housing investment fund, that you'll get dealt with as soon as you can get things to them that are decent proposals. So yeah, the answer is yes, we are forming and ready to put our best foot forward with the sector to make sure Queensland gets its fair share of the HAF. And Nathan, apologies if I've got you under strife with other jurisdictions here.
Thanks, Mark. There was another question from the floor.
Thanks, Michael. Sherry Broonhouse here from Homes Victoria. Trudi, you mentioned in your opening statements about these sort of rolling natural disasters, floods, fires, and all the states are experiencing similar. And I just was interested in the reflections of the panel on, responding to these emerging emergencies that seem to now be a rolling and almost a permanent sort of state of our social service system, and balancing that with these new innovation growth opportunities and how you're managing to look after both areas effectively.
Thanks, Sherry. Hi, good to see you. Look, it's a really interesting predicament that we face, and obviously I'll talk to Victoria, but I think we can talk to the 7 million people that live in regional and rural Australia, which are all faced with the climate challenges. In terms of what we need to do as both a homeless and a housing organisation is really understand and be prepared for the upcoming events, and we are, at Haven Home Safe, are definitely part of those preparedness conversations around what does it mean, how do we put some strategies in place, and what do we need to do to ensure that those communities, one, have a prepared plan in place, but certainly there's an outcome for where we can actually put these people in the emergencies. We were talking before about all the COVID facilities that are still sitting idle. So, certainly there's some areas within the state of Victoria that we can move people to in an emergency and a crisis perspective. But again, we're moving people out of the places that they live. So in Victoria, particularly through the Rochester floods of last year, we moved everyone to the Elmore Field Days, and that was great for a period of time. However, it doesn't look into focus on how do we shift a community onto one site when we actually don't have a lens into it. There will be family violence, there will be other risk factors, there will be a significant amount of complexity of bringing those people onto site. So it's very much a coordinated effort across both government and the sector, and particularly homeless service organisations, that can come together to find a collaborative pathway forward. So that's certainly part of the conversation at the moment, and hopefully we won't be surprised this year because we have certainly great plans in place.
I think probably from a planning perspective, certainly in Western Australia, and I'm sure across the country, planning reform is also taking, I guess, a holistic view at climate responsive planning policy, particularly as it relates to coastal planning policy, in a potential future flooding, inundation. Bushfire risk is significant for us as it is in the rest of the country. So bushfire planning policy is being reviewed and mapped, and so I think from a planning perspective, it's really important that we are designing and building our communities now and in anticipation of increasing volatility from a climate perspective, and not just in the planning stage, but the actual physical asset and operation of the asset, and how that from an energy efficiency perspective is increasingly important, and we've seen a lot of change there in the National Construction Code around energy efficiency provisions and other things come into play. So I think there's a lot of work being done in that space, and from a developer perspective, I think the positive conversation around ESG, and particularly larger listed companies like Mirvac, Sue was talking about yesterday, Lendlease, Stockland, all the large listed developers have significant ESG commitments and increasingly focused on a social licence to operate, which I think is positive for social and affordable housing, as well as climate responsive development.
There was another question across from the microphone at the moment, but before we come to that, one of the questions through the app, Emma, for you in particular, but for the others as well, please jump in, asking what policy and planning changes do you see as needed to facilitate more co-housing or multi-household dwellings and really sort of open up that opportunity to create sort of sharing type opportunities. There's a suggestion here that in Victoria there's not sufficient flexibility or the categories in the planning system to easily facilitate that. So what would it take?
Yes, it's quite a complex, I suppose, proposal as well. So it probably starts with the tenancy laws, and they are quite different in shared housing, and I think there's also a fairly strong perception within the private rental market that a shared home will be somewhere where people will come and go a lot. There's not a lot of stability in it. There's not a lot of structure. It tends to be facilitated often by private landlords, and there's issues around the quality of that. And that's certainly something we're working with the South Australian Government on in relation to tenancy laws. So I guess if we reflect on that and think about what does work when we see social and community housing doing it well, that has to be sort of a leadership model that the private sector looks to, and it may not be private investors, it may be more institutional investors, sort of again following more of the community model. So I think that potentially some private landlords would be interested in that model, but I think we need to really separate it from the concept of shared housing within the private space to make sure that it's workable, it's great quality, and it provides, you know, sustainable lifestyle that people want to enjoy and stay there and be part of the community.
Have others been looking at this, Mark? Is this something the department's been considering?
So I didn't quite hear the question, Michael.
Around co-housing or other types of sort of multi-household dwellings.
Yeah, we have rooming accommodation legislation in Queensland, and that does happen here. Also, our colleagues in the Department of State Development, Planning, Infrastructure and Local Government are doing some fantastic work in this space. They've released the draft South East Queensland Regional Plan, which sets down the challenge to supply an additional 900,000 dwellings by 2046 just in the southeast corner, but it also talks about the diversity of dwelling type, it talks about the gentle density on it, so that's been out for consultation. I know a lot of people have provided feedback on that. There's a legislation going into the Parliament today, according to media reports, I can comment otherwise, but there is called the Housing Affordability and Availability Bill, and that again makes other changes that will support all different types of housing outcomes. And you know, results of the summit that we talked about before, the government moved swiftly on suggestions from the summit to change the legislation around granny flats so that they could be used for those people other than your family or relatives, that you could actually rent those out. And last time I checked, there was over 500 deposit bonds lodged with the Residential Tenancies Authority for those initiatives. So, yeah, it should be all on the table.
Terrific. The granny flats idea was floated in South Australia very recently. How was that received by the real estate sector?
Look, I think that if the land is there and it can be used and it's going to create a good environment, again, I suppose it's that mix of the people living in both quarters being comfortable with that as well. And that's probably a bit of a society change back. It was very popular many years ago, particularly with migrant families, and often the grandparents would live in those, of course, named granny flat. So I think it's probably moving back to that and people wanting that sense of community within their own space, and that can provide a lot of opportunity as well, and assist in families sharing resources and getting to the next level so they can have their own home and perhaps do that again and support another family. So I think we're very supportive of those moves, and again, it's just one piece of the puzzle, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a question over here.
Thank you. Just following up on that theme, one of the challenges we find in our Central Victorian Shire is that there's a lot of resident-driven desire. So it's not coming from the investment sector, but residents looking for those different models of delivering housing. And at this point, the planning scheme is really still very clunky. You know, they've got to try and work around categories, try and work with rooming house categories, or try and work with retirement village or other categories. So I'm interested in whether there's a national conversation going on around how the approach of the planning schemes around the country can shift to be more adaptive to those models that really reflect the way people want and need to live now.
Who would like to respond to that?
Well, look, I don't live in Victoria, obviously, but I think as a broad point nationally, obviously there is a significant focus on planning reform as one of the, I guess, conditions of investment under the Housing Accord and the HAF. And I think the experience, certainly from a WA perspective, is historically that the complexity, duplication and rigidity of the planning system has meant that innovative new housing models are incredibly difficult to get approved, and if they do, it takes an incredible amount of time. And so what I'm hoping is that under this sort of the HAF and the significant investment made in most of the states and territories towards social and affordable housing, that conversation around having more flexible planning system and even some national consistency from a planning perspective would also be welcome, so that those innovative models and design concepts can be readily accepted rather than sort of being put through the ringer.
And I guess just to add to that, the recent National Cabinet meeting looking at housing issues has had reports back from housing ministers, but also from planning ministers, and so we have a national blueprint that we're working towards around the planning system. We have a whole lot of better renting measures from the housing ministers. So there's sort of a couple of avenues there that National Cabinet are progressing to try and get some national consistency and improvements there. All right, I might take another question through the portal. There's a lot to choose from here, I'm not quite sure. Actually, what I want to do is I want to come back to the regional population shift question. There's a couple of questions that speak to that in different ways, but I guess, over the pandemic period, we had exodus from some of the big cities, particularly in Victoria, but this is a national issue. More recently, shift of people from New South Wales and Victoria up into southeast Queensland, putting pressure here, really pressing the crisis here. So, particularly in regional markets, how do you respond to those rapid changes in demand?
Yeah, absolutely. Vacancy rates have fallen to record lows, and rents obviously continue to be unsustainably high, pricing people out of their communities. So as a homeless entry point, particularly in our Bendigo office, we last year saw over 1,500 people that had never accessed homeless services before. So they had been in private rental for 20, 25 years, but because of the changes to the Residential Tenancies Act in Victoria, it left a lot of investors really cautious about what that meant for them and taking away quite a significant amount of their control, which on one level we really welcome because it's really about tenant sustainability, but on the other hand, if you've got people exiting that market, then it also means that those renters that have been in a sustainable environment are being shifted out. I think as CHPs, we have a responsibility that goes far beyond just housing people. We partner with funders, with other organisations to create communities and housing that builds vibrant, diverse and really thriving communities. And the conversation in regional Victoria particularly, and I'm really pleased to see the Victorian Housing Statement, which does start the conversation about that, is how is density done and how is density done well. So in regional Victoria, we're pretty much been the very large blocks and the one house on that block. But the conversation is changing. We're shifting the dial. We've got community interest to have more density, and people want to have a diverse range of properties and housing. So I think as the housing statement comes to fruition, particularly with 800,000 homes over the next decade, I think we need to have all the policies, all the different types of planning mechanisms and levers to make sure that those houses can be delivered.
Mark, the Housing Supply Expert Panel in Queensland has shifted its focus from just being a South East Queensland focus to whole of Queensland focus. I think more broadly, the Department of Housing and other agencies are really concerned about housing markets across the regions of Queensland. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And the challenges are acute, and perhaps more acute in that getting trades and builders and stock in regional and remote Queensland is much more challenging and much more expensive perhaps than in the southeast corner. So recognising that and the important role that local governments play, we've worked with the Local Government Association of Queensland, for those that aren't from Queensland, and also the Western Alliance of Councils in Queensland to develop individual local housing action plans for each council based on what they think is best for their local government area. I think there's about 22 of those now completed in the west of the state, and there's another 38 underway. So they are really important in terms of how we activate, deliver more housing, more diverse housing. As well as that, one of our partner agencies in Energy and Public Works has set up two factories, I think, at the moment to do modern methods of construction. And then there's Hutchie's Builders have also got a factory at Yatala doing that. And so we are shipping homes out to the far west reaches of the state, to Longreach, I think, were the last deliveries, to Gympie, you name it. But I think there's 100 already on the pipeline ready to be shipped out. So we are trying to do everything we can. We're looking also at government employee housing, because we are a big taker of stock in regional remote communities for government employees. So we're looking to provide that stock off market so that the on market properties that they may be occupying can be freed up as well. So there's no lever that we're not looking at for those challenges, because the figures I mentioned before, and as Victoria experienced, that movement to regional Queensland has been extraordinarily strong since COVID. Yeah.
I think that leads into it. There are a couple of questions sort of swirling around an issue of key worker housing, or not just key workers, but actually workers more broadly. And Tanya actually talking about the mining industry and what responsibility does it have to provide housing for its workers. You know, some of that's FIFO, but some of it's not. How's the industry there taking that approach?
Yeah, I think you know, one of the biggest challenges that we face in WA, and in particular in the Pilbara, is that we've got the large mining companies, you know, the Rios and BHPs, FMGs, etc. They tend to, it is easier for them to go and build temporary workforce accommodation, or dongas as we like to call them, and build these workers camps. And what we've been trying to do as a state is encourage, I guess, the long-term economic growth and diversification of the regional towns, so that it is not just a flash in the pan when mining is sort of, you know, particularly active, then the town is pumping. But when that project closes down, it becomes a ghost town. And so how do we build, I guess, more sustainable regional centres? And with that comes the housing consideration. But it's not just the housing consideration. When I did quite a bit of work in Karratha, and one of the challenges we faced in Karratha was that people would relocate to Karratha for work, usually mining, but when their children got to high school age or end of high school age, they would relocate back to Perth, because the lack of education infrastructure and other things were significant factors that, so they're not sticky towns, you know, they don't have the upfront investment in infrastructure to keep people there. So I think that's still something that is a significant issue. Key worker accommodation is a massive issue, not just in the regional centres in WA, but also in Perth. Teachers, police, nurses, etc., you know, like in many other cities, are priced out of housing that is within a reasonable commute to where they're working. I think one of the challenges is we don't have, I guess, one accountable authority for key worker accommodation across the entire state. We do have a focus on regional key workers, but less so in the metro. So yeah, I think it's a massive issue, and is only, I guess, exacerbating the challenge we have around attracting teachers, police and nurses into that particular occupation as well, particularly as we need them to migrate to Perth from other cities.
It's a long way to go.
It's not that far.
Trudi, this is a regional challenge as well, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I was just reflecting on that, and we talk about key workers, and it's more palatable to think about teachers and nurses, etc. But there is a lot more other key workers, and particularly in regional Australia, with a shortage of 36,000 social and affordable properties in regional Victoria. The funding presents a huge opportunity that's coming through, because the regions are a lifeblood of Australia, and I think that's missing part of the conversation. That it's the Mildura, it's the picking of the fruit, it's the collecting the chickens, it's the, it is very much the lifeblood of Australia, and we really need to be investing in our regional people. We need to get the housing supply right, and we need to see the flow-on benefits from this in terms of regional productivity. So yes, 36,000 shortage just in housing more generally, but in terms of where people want to live and where that produce is coming from, it's a real challenge.
Emma, in the private real estate market, are you seeing landlords increasingly looking to house key workers? Is that sort of motive starting to show up?
I think because the demand is so high right now, they're really looking at each application as it comes in. I think that was a real focus for NRAS when it was launched over 10 years ago. And probably over time that drifted, like with the different ranges in which people could have income. But I think the intent of that was there. I think in certain areas, certainly when we have properties sort of more that are really close to large medical centres or things like that, we often have the landlords thinking that they'll get doctors and nurses, and even though it's a 2-bedroom unit that needs a bit of maintenance. But I think there's probably an education piece around that in what type of accommodation people are looking forward to suit different subsets as well, and planning a little bit more in that. So that's probably sort of some micro planning to some extent, because it's not going to be large developments, but making sure that they're in those key areas for when people do come from not only interstate but overseas as well. That's safe to say, isn't it? It doesn't create tension between the states, but that's certainly something that every state is trying to do at the moment in attracting doctors, nurses, teachers, aged care workers. So I think, again, it's something that I'd like to see put in the mix, and so what can we do to get that conversation front and centre and attract the right type of investors and long-term landlords to that sector.
Lots of great questions coming through the app, but I believe there's another one over here.
Hi. Deb Lee here from the New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Peaks, and I also sit on First Peoples Disability Network. I'm just going to throw something at you fellas, and Mark, I'll take you up on your offer to shout us all a feed later. So look, what I'd like to know is, we're having a conversation today. I understand this is an extremely challenging conversation on a national level. But if we talk about this, we are talking about an able market, okay? And what I'm hearing, so we work with Mob Living with a Disability nationally. So, for many of those families, it could be stolen, Jen, there is no ID. So if we talk to Link Up, just for example, in New South Wales, it's well over a 12 to 24 month wait just to access your ID. So, that's one issue. Up there in Cairns, so I'm a proud Yidinji Jalbu from up round China Camp. And look, we're supporting many families out there that just do not have the ID. But more importantly, what I'm not hearing is, how are we as a nation going to look at mob living with a disability and the acute psychosocial that is ever increasing daily? So if we talk about affordability and accessibility, you know, those conversations need to start including mob living with a disability, and disability is certainly something I'm not hearing across this, you know, this forum here today. And I think it's critical that considerations be given. How do we as a country develop a presumed period of consent or a presumed period of access in those moments where, for example, somebody may be acutely unwell, you know, 7 months of their life, they may have been in hospital. However, for the next 3 months, you know, they're going to want to come out and they're going to need stable accommodation. So, you know, when we talk about the New South Wales Housing Minister, there was certainly, in my observation, a very delayed response around bringing New South Wales up to speed with the other states, so that, you know, mob who live in cross-border communities and things like that don't get, you know, even further hit with unfair disadvantage. So is there and can there be conversation more around responding to disability? Because as we know, we've got over 3,000 beds blocked up in the hospital system here because we can't release mob to no accommodation, and most of those are living with disability. So yeah, I would really applaud and encourage everyone to take that lens and that voice around mob living with a disability, because I don't think that some of these answers, yes, they're great and they're fantastic considerations, but they don't necessarily respond to our mob. So for example, when our advocates out there in the park up there in Cairns and you got no ID, you got no phone, you got nothing, how, first of all, we're only funded, you know, for one advocate in that state as a national peak, how does she then encourage or support mob to even access housing when it's such a roadmap? Thanks, guys.
Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate that. Look, there are certainly a number of other perspectives we could have on this panel and would probably like to have on this panel, but we'll certainly look to for future sessions. Who would like to just start off on that? Trudi?
I'd be very happy to. Thank you so much for your question. And certainly in Victoria, through the Big Housing Build, the Homes for Aboriginal Victorians is certainly focused on ensuring that we have greater access and greater determination for Aboriginal people coming into the housing market. And we, all CHPs are working with ACOs across the state to ensure that we can work in partnership to drive housing models that actually are accommodating their needs, not us putting our own understanding within that. So that's certainly something that we're working on in Victoria. In terms of the disability, the CHPs in Victoria are absolutely operating to that high standard. So livability, we don't follow that in the National Construction Code as it is now. We are all pretty much at the 7 to 8 star. So we always knew that it was really important to jump to that, to have quality provision of housing, to ensure that we, you know, through placemaking principles, through measuring our ESG and impacts, that we can certainly see the uplift in the housing that we've been able to offer. And I'm really proud that Victoria has put that in place through the Big Housing Build and the expectation on the sector to deliver high quality, affordable housing, but for long term that has greater sustainability.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Sharon, for calling that out. And not the ice creams, that is, the issues. Thank you. Look, I think it's really important. I'm coming to grips with this anew, but in my business in the Department of Housing, we decided that rather than separate functions in our First Nations business, we actually have a integrated department within a department. So our First Nations business is completely vertically integrated within our Department of Housing because they have those very important relationships and can deliver whatever the services, products, housing that's required in community. And they've been out and about developing our second Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing action plan and having yarning circles across the state. Government's put $53 million into the budget to support that plan, so I'm hoping that focus on closing the gap, culturally appropriate responses and actually innovative housing solutions will deliver close more of those gaps that we are seeing. I think the one that you called out about hospitals and people in hospitals, we've just started funding, and I can't believe we haven't done this, but we now fund facilities for First Nations people discharged from hospital to live in, so that they don't become homeless by virtue of the fact that they have to keep going back as day patients for treatment post-discharge. So we've just put $4 million into a facility in Cairns, where our highest demand is. So because we were having that very situation, either they couldn't get discharged from hospital, or they were, but couldn't go back to community because they had to keep going back for ongoing treatment, which, having that as a reason for people experiencing homelessness is unacceptable. So we're now in that business as well, where we will provide accommodation co-located with health facilities, so that doesn't happen.
You can probably just add, from experience, I spent 18 months working in Western Australia for the government on remote Aboriginal communities. So there's 274 remote Aboriginal communities in Western Australia. One of the observations through doing that work, I think, is just reinforces the need for lived experience to inform the way that we design housing that suits, that is person-centred, place-based and all of that sort of thing, that we're not delivering housing that works in a metropolitan context or other contexts and then trying to pick that up and plonk it in a remote Aboriginal community when it just doesn't work and it doesn't meet their needs. So I think making sure that lived experience is at the heart of how we design housing, both as from a remote communities or Aboriginal perspective and specialist disability accommodation, is really important. The other observation I'd probably make in Western Australia, our housing strategy represents the housing continuum, obviously, from homelessness to home ownership. But really importantly, the most recent strategy, it weaves in the support continuum. So from sort of stabilising to support to empowerment to enabling at the end, that there is the need for those support structures to enable people who require transitional housing or other supports to move between different housing types as their needs change. We do have a significant investment in Aboriginal housing in Western Australia. We have Aboriginal short stay accommodation and other forms of transitional housing for similar purposes to what was discussed before. But yeah, I think it's just really critical to keep coming back to making sure that we're designing homes that are appropriate for the tenants that are going to be living there.
Thank you. I'll come to some portal questions in a moment, but I believe there's one high up here.
There is. Travis Gilbert, I manage ACT Shelter. I'm also the Vice Chair of National Shelter. It's always great to come to these things and realise that while Michaela Cash is right, I am an overeducated elite. Collectively, we don't live in a Canberra bubble and we share many of the same challenges and opportunities. I wanted to, it sort of leads on from that question in terms of when a novel coronavirus arrived, we saw some fantastic collaboration in the ACT between health providers and peaks and housing services and homelessness workers and the directorates. Then the vaccines came, as important as they were. That role that housing played in terms of overcrowded housing leading to higher levels of transmission in Sydney and Melbourne and eventually remote New South Wales sort of dissipated and we went back to business as usual in a sense. What can we do to reinvigorate that important focus on housing as health infrastructure, which the public messaging of stay home, save lives really unmasked very early on, boom tish, in the pandemic? What can we do to reinvigorate that role of housing as either an enabler of better health or as a driver of really poor health outcomes when it's insecure, when violence is likely, when it's poor quality?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I'm not sure I can follow that question though. Look, to us it is well known the outcomes you get across the system from having appropriate housing outcomes. So we know the benefits to individuals, we know the cost benefit to the justice system, to the health system, to the education system. They all benefit from the outcomes of stable housing. I think, in fact, AHURI might have even done a report on this, Michael, which is probably where I'm getting this from, so maybe you should answer this question. But we certainly, in terms of making the case for enhanced investment around different housing products and outcomes, use that whole of system benefit to bolster our business case. So it is not lost on us, and it's not lost on us either about all the tremendous work that was done, particularly by the sector and parts of government during that COVID response. And I hope we're still taking some of those lessons forward with us. But I know, Michael, AHURI, great report.
I do have some thoughts on it, yes.
Yeah.
And I think, the point Travis is making, that the connection between housing and health and the coordination between housing agencies and health agencies was a key feature of pandemic responses. And the extent to which that has slipped away and gone back to business as usual is probably disappointing. But I think there is a bit more of a connection than there was before the pandemic, and there's certainly a need to build on that. So I think there's an onus on all of us to push that message and really engage with public health particularly, but also with direct community health services and so on for that. Trudi, is this something that you see in your work?
Oh, absolutely. We absolutely all understand that the social determinants of health is based on the foundation of a good, stable home. And yes, in the pandemic, we saw all of this appetite to ensure that with roofs over people's heads, that we were actually providing much better health outcomes as well. Interestingly, got some anecdotal stories that in Victoria, when these, with more income coming in with stable accommodation, that people's health had got better and they had not had to get doctor intervention. As soon as that money slipped away, then they were back to the doctor, etc. So we were seeing a lot more people not needing the health sector, which was really important. We also see in terms of our programs that we run around stable housing, but wraparound supports for people that need it at the time that they certainly need it, and where they're presenting to us finds that we are saving, in terms of an ESG impact, $13 to government of avoided costs because of the wraparound support, and the tailored services for individuals is so critical to ensure that the outcomes that you speak of actually can be there. Can we do it again? Absolutely. It's appetite, right? The only people getting in the way of anything is ourselves. So I think we've got had the appetite then we certainly should have the appetite now.
Thank you. I might move to a couple of the app questions and perhaps possibly some quicker questions. They might almost be yes or no questions, I'm not sure. But looking at the national cabinet reforms or the agenda set out there around better renting and the move towards national consistency or a level of national consistency around our rental tenancies, in particular around eliminating no-cause evictions from those systems. What's the Real Estate Institute's view on that agenda?
So we're going through legislative reform at the moment in South Australia and seeking to learn lessons from Queensland and Victoria and more recently sort of New South Wales in the implementation there. There are some concerns on whether no-cause evictions, as the media does call them, is something that is a disincentive for landlords and whether it is going to cause panic in the market. So I think that needs to be carefully considered and managed. But I mean, as an industry, the better that we have housing for the community and the stronger the community, the cycle keeps going. So I think that there's a lot of common ground as we work through those things to ensure that the market's fair for everyone in that private rental market. And again, the private rental market can't cater for everybody.
Sure.
So understanding sort of where those crossovers and where we can work together more collaboratively with public, social and community housing as well.
But, the ACT have already removed no-cause eviction from the system there. Did that cause panic in the market?
Well, certainly our agents believe that it did. There's been some anecdotal evidence in Victoria, but I'm aware that there hasn't been any sort of longitude studies done on that yet. So I can't say definitively, but yeah, it's a legitimate concern for our industry, yes, which we are concerned will have knock-on effects for tenants as well.
It's a slightly loaded question in that AHURI has done some work on this and suggests that it's just a normal level of churn and those reforms haven't actually
I think that's
changed the market.
Done before COVID though as well, so we've had the exit because of sort of capital growth as well, so yeah.
Taking the heat off you for a moment. Trudi, no cause evictions in the community housing space, it operates a little differently. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, look, and I think we find it as a quite positive in that sense, is that absolutely our role is to sustain housing. There is, you know, this belief that even CHPs evict people often, which is certainly not the case, but we have greater levers now within the Residential Tenancies Act. It's absolutely about sustaining tenancies, and that's absolutely what we want to do. However, the changes in the within the housing statement do provide a little bit more levers in terms of moving people through on bonds, certainly looking at the way that VCAT is offered through a mediation process. All of these things we welcome, because currently it takes 18 weeks to even get a hearing through to VCAT, which is not fair for, you know, the landlord, certainly the CHP, but particularly the residents, that we need to ensure that they have an outcome, and they have the outcome and they know what their housing history and their housing future looks like. So really welcome the reforms. It's very early days. We are seeing some challenges within that, but like any new legislation, it's just a bumpy road until we all align.
Mark, Queensland's been progressing quite a few rental reforms. What's your view of the sort of the package that's come through?
So we prohibited no grounds evictions as part of our stage 1 rental reforms, which again was related to the Housing Summit. We introduced legislation to limit rent increases to once 12 months per tenancy. We've had a discussion paper out there recently, which we're now considering about whether to limit the increases to 12 months for the property, so regardless of whether tenancy changes as well, and we'll discuss that with Governor coming months. So we also introduced minimum standards for rentals, some of which I felt that, you know, being new to the portfolio, I thought, this is minimum standards in 2023, you know, not to have mould, to have drinking water, you know, sort of, to me, I thought, wow, that's taken a while, but it's there. So, and, you know, have curtains on bedrooms and doors on bathrooms. But I'm so pleased that those reforms were done, and so we're now got our stage 2 reforms that have been out for consultation, and we'll talk with government about what they might introduce as well. But yes, certainly no grounds evictions have already been prohibited in Queensland.
And perhaps just moving along from that, one of the questions we've had is how will the National Housing and Homelessness Plan that consultations are happening for right now, and Queensland's housing strategy, how will they interact?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're deeply engaged with the Commonwealth around the issues paper that they've had out recently for consultation as we go ahead and develop our 20-year Queensland housing plan. So it's with the clarity we're now getting through much improved intergovernmental relations with the Commonwealth in recent times, I think there's the opportunity there to be strongly aligned between what the Commonwealth does and what we do, and to be complementary to it as well, and to Darren's first question today, to take advantage of the numerous programs that the Commonwealth has now announced, which are significant amounts of money that we certainly want to see a share come to Queensland around those. So yeah, good opportunity, and we're getting great engagement from the Commonwealth, and I really thank them for that.
So one of the questions that's come through a few different ways is the 1.2 million homes national target.
Yeah.
Queensland's share of that is
200 and something. It's about 20% roughly.
Yeah, about 20%. So
20%.
240,000, something like that.
Yeah.
You going to do it?
Well, we've got to be ambitious. I was just saying to Michael before we were sitting in the, well, it wasn't a green room. I thought it'd be a green room, but we were sitting at the back before we came in here, that watching the commentary last night, and people say, gee, that's going to be really tough to do. And then others saying, well, you don't want to be too ambitious. Well, I think we need to be ambitious. I think we need to have a crack, and we need to hit the target. That's our ambition. We've set it ourselves in If you look at the South East Queensland Regional Plan that's been out there for draft, it sets a target of 900,000 homes by 2046. It's enormous. If you extrapolate that out to Queensland, it's another bigger number again. So we welcome the call targets, and we're setting our own targets, and we're going to shoot for those. We're going to do everything we can to get there.
Tanya, one of the things that you alluded to in your opening remarks was around that sort of gentle density increasing, some infill development in the middle suburbs and so on. To what extent is the sort of NIMBYism that we've tended to have over recent decades, is that shifting?
It depends where you live, basically. In some areas, no, I don't think it's shifting. But I think as an industry, we need to ensure that when we deliver density, we deliver it well. And we deliver it in a context that considers the local community and what I guess they want to see for their local neighbourhood. There's some fantastic examples of great density done well, but equally there are some horrid examples of density as well, and I think that doesn't help when we're having this conversation around the need for apartments and 1 and 2 bedroom product that there's some pretty horrid examples that the community will latch onto and say, well, I just don't want that next to me. So I think we need to do better as an industry. I think we need to do better. We need to design density better. One of the challenges that we have, which I was commenting before in Perth, is that over 80% of our housing stock is 3, 4, 5 bedroom stock. And the greatest demand from a social housing perspective is for 1 bedroom, 1 or 2 bedrooms. The greatest cohort on the wait list is single people that require that support. So we just don't have the stock to respond to that. So hence it drives this significant issue of underutilisation and under-occupation, not just in social housing, but also in private housing. So that's why we talk about things like stamp duty and other things that may prohibit people from what we say right-sizing, depending on their life circumstances at the time. People need to be able to not be prohibited from changing their household type when their needs change because of punitive taxation measures and other things. So yeah, I think we need to do better as an industry, but then I think there's also a piece of work around acceptance of the need for density, because equally we always get the criticism about urban sprawl in Perth because we're such a long, stretched out city across the coast. But the reality of that is it is easier to deliver house and land packages. It is easier to deliver land development than it is to get an apartment building constructed at the moment. It's faster, it responds to spikes in demand quicker, just the nature of the product. And so if we don't have an urban growth boundary in Perth yet, but I'm sure that's probably on the radar. So if that's the case, then we need to have a more holistic conversation as a community around what great density looks like, and it doesn't have to be, a tower. It's that sort of townhouse 3 to 5 story medium density that I think is accepted to a large degree. But again, we need to make sure that it's done well.
Mark, did you want to add to that on infill development, medium density, NIMBYism, that whole bundle?
Yeah, so I think, and I don't say a planning department or someone in Planning Institute, they coined it gentle density.
Yeah.
Sounds much nicer, doesn't it? It's gentle density. But there is definitely a missing, in Brisbane, there's a missing middle, right, where we feel that, there's a lot of greenfields on the edges, which used to be an affordable product, but it's not so much anymore. And to hit our targets, we're going to have to see more of that general density in the middle ring. We're very good. The observation we made that we're very good in Queensland about doing the high-rise apartments in the city and the greenfields on the edge. But we don't have that cottage industry that exists perhaps in other cities where they do that gentle density, the townhouse and other developments in that middle ring as yet. But I think that's the challenge that's set out in the draft Shaping SEQ Regional Plan. And I think there's acceptance now that needs to happen gently.
We call it dumb density in Perth.
Sorry?
Dumb density, like stupid density. But we also have, this issue where our planning policy is responding to what we call mum and dad developers who subdivide their large block and then put 2 or 3 units on it. They're doing it for obviously, profit or return, as most people do. But the design, the way that that's delivered is not done in a holistic sense. So you're getting all of this, what they call dumb density, where you've got, yes, you're getting, 2 or 3 homes versus 1 on a block, but it's not done particularly well. The site's not being utilised as best that it could. It's not energy efficient, housing construction, all that sort of thing. So the WA government's response to that is, a medium density design code, making sure that they're far more prescriptive around how that type of infill is developed in the future.
And Trudi, this isn't just a capital city conversation either. This is increasingly something we're hearing regionally.
Look, absolutely. We are certainly seeing that. I was having a little chuckle because I think density done well, but a lot more. I mean, in Victoria, you look around, you see all these new suburbs coming up and the new train stations, and the most productive land around those train stations is car parking. Like, what a missed opportunity. We should be developing medium density properties on that is more accessible for people that need it. I think you need to look to the CHP sector. We're doing some of the most innovative builds with placemaking, with transport-oriented design, with 5-minute communities, really focusing on new urbanism principles. And I think that's something that we need to really be talking about in this country. There's some wonderful examples overseas on how that is being done and how density is being done. And we can look to the cities that we all love, Hong Kong, Japan, etc. They all live in this way. And if it's good enough to visit, then I think it's good enough to have in our backyards. But certainly in regional Victoria, it is a discussion around density. There is, yes, there's some of that NIMBYism, but there's also just the fear of what that looks like. So we just need to keep challenging the status quo because it's the least safest option and keep working. And I think we do have an absolute appetite within the regions to get the density and do it well, but do it with placemaking principles to ensure that we have vibrancy and thriving communities there as well.
Thank you. A question that I'm actually going to read this one verbatim because I want to get this right. So the Disability Royal Commission just handed down its final report, which recommended that more inclusive and accessible housing must be built. That includes all states adopting a new livable housing standards under the National Construction Code. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about disability housing and the need for it to be much more available, much more visible. Mark, did you want to start off?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, as we build, look to do a great deal of platinum and gold standard homes under the National Construction Code. Makes it, and I think that's the right thing to do. So in every single one of our builds, we will look to do to the platinum or gold level.
Trudi, is this an area of focus for you?
One would say it's a no-brainer, absolutely. We've been very much ahead of the National Building Code for some time, and majority of our properties are certainly at that livable standard. What we also have been finding out through some of our stats and data is that 75% of my tenants actually have a form of disability. So it's absolutely upon us to ensure that we have housing that is fit for purpose, but so that people can not only age in place, but certainly live out their lives in the homes that they have. And that can only be made easier if all housing is actually livable for all people and accessible for everybody. So that's certainly the goal at Haven Home Safe, and I know the Victorian Government is certainly pushing that as well.
For sure.
We're certainly seeing NDIS providers come more to the private sector seeking rental accommodation, which of course you would expect, but often you are seeing that the homes have to be modified so substantially, which causes delays, which causes anxiety, which causes additional costs that NDIS providers have to put out. So I think having like a smarter build that accommodates that is a win-win for everybody. I think probably in some circumstances where particular homes are needed, I think there needs to be a bit of funding for that, because they're trying to fit something square into a round hole, and it's not necessarily a good outcome for everybody. So I think having some provision for that as well will be really valuable to give that balance of utilising the private market and also having specialist need sort of accommodation where it's needed too. So again, they're sort of fitting into the different parts rather than everything trying to fit into what's already there and isn't perfect, and in many cases was built 40 years ago.
Tanya, in your area, is this an increasing demand that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, further to comment around the ageing population, we know that that's a significant issue. In the private market, certainly we're seeing a greater demand from, I guess, the downsizers that are, wanting to get out of their large home and moving into apartments. And absolutely, I think there's definitely a focus on making sure that those apartments are designed in a way that are either adaptable or accessible to make sure that they are able to age in place. I think that one of the challenges is there is additional cost that comes with that. So there's a balancing act when it's, death by 1,000 cuts and lots of additional expenditure adding to construction costs in an environment where it's already challenging to get apartments in particular to work feasibly without subsidy. That's a challenge, I think, for the private market at times, depending on where they're building. But absolutely, I think everything needs to be accessible. It's the same with energy efficiency. There's things now that just, it's, like you said, a no-brainer.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time now. There were lots more great questions on the app I would love to have got to, and I suspect quite a few more from the floor. But I want to thank everyone for all of those questions that have really fed a fascinating conversation, and ask you all to join me in thanking our panel. Thank you again to Link Wentworth for their sponsorship of this session and the conferences previously. We'll go to morning tea in just a second, for those of you who are here in person. Can I just ask anyone who has tickets for tonight's dinner that isn't able to go, can you please let us know at the information desk? We do have a very eager waiting list hoping to get a seat, so please let us know. Meanwhile, off to morning tea. Thank you.